The carriage door slammed shut behind her. Rain hammered the roof in waves so loud she couldn't hear her own breathing. Her hands were shaking. Her dress was soaked through to the skin. She pressed her back against the wooden wall and tried to disappear into the dark. For a moment she thought she was safe. Then a voice spoke from the shadows across from her. Low, calm, far too calm for a man whose carriage had just been invaded in the middle of a storm. "You're either very brave," the voice said, "or very lost. Which is it?" Alara stopped breathing. She couldn't see him, only the outline of a man, broad shoulders, head tilted, just slightly watching her, the way a wolf watches something small and bleeding. The lantern between them had gone out. The only light was the lightning, and it came in flashes just long enough to show her his eyes. Silver, pale silver like the moon behind a cloud. She had never seen eyes like that on a human. Her hand reached for the door behind her. His voice came again softer this time, and somehow that was worse. "I wouldn't open that door if I were you." Outside the storm screamed. Inside, the stranger waited. And Alara, soaked, terrified, with a bruise on her wrist she hadn't been able to hide, realized she had just trapped herself with something far more dangerous than the storm. 3 hours earlier, she had everything to lose, and she had decided to run anyway. The forest swallowed her within minutes. The path through the orchard ended at a low stone wall, and beyond the wall was the eastern road, and beyond the road was the dark mass of the king's forest, vast unmapped, full of things her nurse had warned her about when she was small. Wolves, witches, beasts that walked like men. Alara climbed the wall anyway. The rain started before she reached the tree line. It came down in sheets, the kind of rain that turned the world into smeared silver, and within a quarter of an hour her cloak was so heavy with water that she had to grip it closed with both hands to keep walking. She didn't have a plan. She knew that. Plan was a word for people who had options. She had one direction away, and she had as many hours of darkness as the storm would give her before her father's men started looking. After that, she would think. After that, she would survive. The thunder cracked closer now. The trees around her bent in the wind. Somewhere far off, she thought she heard a horse scream, and the sound made her stop dead in the mud, every nerve in her body singing with fear. Voss's men already. She forced herself to move again, faster. Branches whipped her face, her boots filled with water. Twice she fell, once into a shallow ditch that soaked her to the hip, once over a root she didn't see, and the second time she stayed down for a long, shaking moment with her cheek pressed to the cold earth and thought, I can't do this. I should go back. She thought of the white dress hanging from the wardrobe door. She thought of Voss's hand patting her head when she was 11. She thought of 3 women whose names no one was allowed to say. She got up. The trees broke open in front of her without warning. She stumbled out into a small clearing, a wide spot, where the road bent the kind of place travelers used to rest, and there, half hidden under the dripping arms of an enormous oak, was a carriage, black, lacquered, far finer than anything she had ever seen on this road. The horses were gone unhitched, perhaps led to shelter, and the windows were dark. No lantern, no driver. No sound but the rain on the lacquered roof. Abandoned, she thought. The driver must have taken the horses ahead to a posting house, left the carriage to ride out the storm. A roof. She didn't think. She couldn't afford to think. She ran. She splashed through the muddy ruts of the road, climbed the small iron step at the side of the carriage, and gripped the door handle with both hands. For one heartbeat, she hesitated. Some old instinct, the kind of instinct her grandmother used to call the wolf warning, the prickle on the back of the neck that meant something is watching. But the rain was so loud, and her hands were so cold, and she was so tired. She pulled the door open. She climbed inside. She slammed it shut behind her. And then, in the long, dark silence that followed, while her chest heaved and water dripped from her hair onto the velvet seat, she heard him breathe. Someone else was in the carriage, someone who had been sitting in the dark listening to her run. The lightning flashed once white and merciless, and for one stretched second, she saw him. Broad shoulders, a long dark coat, A face she would remember for the rest of her life, sharp, still beautiful in a way that wasn't safe. And his eyes were silver. The lightning died. The dark came back. And his voice, low, calm, and far too patient, drifted across the space between them, like a hand reaching for her throat. "You're either very brave," he said, "or very lost. Which is it?" For a long moment, Alara couldn't speak. The rain hammered the roof. Her own pulse hammered in her ears. The man across from her hadn't moved, hadn't even shifted his weight, and somehow that stillness was the most frightening thing of all. Men who were dangerous moved. Men who were very dangerous did not need to. She found her voice. Barely. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I thought it was empty." Clearly. "I'll go." "No," he said. "You won't." Her hand tightened on the door handle behind her. "I'm not staying here." "You're not going back out there either." A pause. "Sit down." "I don't take orders from strangers in dark carriages." The faintest sound came from across the seat, something that might have been a breath or might have been the beginning of a laugh. He didn't quite let it out. "Fair," he said. "Then take a suggestion. Sit down before you put your hand back on that door and the storm takes it off at the wrist." Outside, as if the storm had been listening, a branch cracked somewhere close and came down with a wet, splintering crash. Alara flinched. Her knees, which had been holding her up out of pure refusal, finally betrayed her. She sank onto the velvet seat opposite him. The dark settled around them again. She kept her hand on the door. He didn't speak for a long time. Alara couldn't tell if he was watching her or simply waiting for her to do something stupid. Both possibilities felt equally likely. Her eyes slowly began to make sense of the shapes in the carriage. The long line of his coat, the gloved hands resting loosely on his thighs, the faint glint of something at his throat, a chain maybe or a clasp. He was very still, the way some animals were still. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost gentle. That somehow made it worse. "What's your name?" "I'm not telling you that." "No. Another pause. "Are you running from someone?" "I'm not telling you that either." "You don't have to. You came through the trees, not the road. Your cloak is too fine for a peasant, and your boots are too sturdy for a lady. Your hair was pinned up at some point this evening. I can see where the pins were. You took them out in a hurry." A beat. "You're running." Alara's breath caught. "You're very observant for a man sitting in the dark." "I have time." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I'm giving you tonight." She swallowed. Her dress was clinging to her, freezing where the silk met her skin, and a long shiver ran through her before she could stop it. She gritted her teeth against the second one. She would not shake in front of him. She would not. He saw it anyway. A soft rustle of fabric, and then something heavy and warm landed across her knees. She nearly screamed. She bit it back into a gasp. It was his coat. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "I didn't ask if you wanted it. I don't need—" "You're shaking so hard the carriage is moving. Put it on." She wanted to throw it back at him. She wanted very badly to be the kind of woman who could refuse warmth out of pride. But the coat smelled like cedar and something colder underneath something like winter wind off a mountain, and it was so warm where his body had been against the lining that her hands curled into it before her mind had given permission. She pulled it around her shoulders. She told herself she only meant it as a shield. "Thank you," she said, because her mother had raised her even if her father had sold her. "Don't thank me yet," he said. The storm worsened. The carriage rocked gently on its springs, but the wood was solid, and the lacquer was new, and the rain that should have been coming through the seams was simply not. Whoever owned this carriage was wealthy. Wealthier than her father, wealthier possibly than Lord Voss, which meant the man across from her was either the owner himself or someone the owner trusted enough to leave alone with it in a forest at midnight. Neither possibility made her feel safer. She tried to study him without being obvious. It was difficult. The dark hid most of him, but in the slow blue pulses of lightning she caught pieces. A jawline, the slope of a shoulder. Once the line of his mouth and her stomach did something she did not have language for. He was younger than she had expected. Not young, but younger than the voice. The voice belonged to a man who had been giving orders for a long time. The face in the fragments she could see belonged to a man who could still remember being given them. Late 20s, perhaps, early 30s. Old enough to be dangerous, young enough to be something else. She made herself stop looking. "Where were you going?" he asked. "Away." Away is not a direction. It is when there's only one place behind you. He went quiet at that. It was a quiet that listened. "And the place behind you," he said. "Is it a place or a person?" She didn't answer. "A person, then." "Stop guessing." "I'm not guessing." A pause. "I can hear it in your voice when I say the wrong word. Place nothing. Person you stopped breathing for half a beat. You're imagining things." "I have unusually good hearing." There was something underneath the way he said it. A weight. As if it were a joke, and not a joke at the same time. She filed it away with the silver eyes and the impossible stillness and the smell of his coat, and she did not let herself look at the pile. Not yet. "How long until the storm passes?" she asked instead. "A few hours, maybe more. And then my driver comes back with the horses, and I take you somewhere you can dry off and eat something hot. I'm not going anywhere with you." "You are, actually." The simple certainty in his voice made the small hairs on the back of her neck rise. "I'm not your prisoner," she said. "No, you're not." "Then I'll leave when the rain stops." "You'll leave," he said, "when I know that the road in front of you isn't worse than the one behind you. Whichever of those two things comes first. That's not your decision. It became my decision when you came through that door. I didn't ask." "I know," he said quietly. "That's the only reason we're still having this conversation." She didn't know how long they sat in silence after that. Long enough for the worst of the wind to drop. Long enough for her shivering to ease slowly beneath the heavy coat. Long enough for her eyes to droop once, twice, and for her to jerk herself upright, furious with her own body every time they did. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "Sleep if you need to," he said. "I'm not closing my eyes in front of you." "You think I'd hurt you?" "I think I don't know you." "Reasonable," he said. "Then don't sleep. But stop fighting it like it's a war. The shaking will come back." She wanted to snap something at him. She couldn't think of what. Instead, against every instinct she had, she let her head rest against the carriage wall behind her, not sleeping, just leaning, listening to the rain, listening to him breathe. His breathing was very even, too even. She had a strange thought then, the kind of thought that came in the small hours of frightening nights. He was breathing on purpose, like a man controlling something, like a man making sure the something stayed controlled. She filed that away too. "You haven't asked me a single question," she said softly. "I've asked you several. You've asked me things you already knew the answers to. You haven't asked me who I am, where I'm from, why I'm in this part of the forest. You haven't asked anything that would tell you what to do with me." He was quiet for a moment. "I know what to do with you." Her stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said slowly, "that I'm not going to ask you those questions tonight. They're the kind of questions that decide things. You haven't slept, you haven't eaten, you're shaking under a coat that's 3 sizes too big for you. I'm not making decisions about you tonight. You just said," "I said I know what to do with you. I do. The first thing is not to question you while you're freezing in the dark. The rest can wait until morning." She didn't know what to say to that. She had been ready for cruelty. She had been ready for indifference. She had been ready in some small, honest corner of herself for a stranger to look at her once and decide she was the same kind of useful thing Lord Voss had decided she was when she was 11 years old. She had not been ready for the rest can wait until morning. Something in her chest did something painful. She turned her face toward the wall so he couldn't see it. The lightning had grown rarer, the thunder more distant. The storm was crawling east the way storms in this country always crawled over the ridge, down into the next valley, leaving the trees dripping in its wake. In one of the longer silences, he spoke again, so softly she almost missed it under the rain. "Show me your wrist." Her whole body locked. "What? Your left wrist. You've been holding it against you since you sat down. You did it twice when you tightened the coat. Show me." "It's nothing." "Then it costs you nothing to show me." "I said it's nothing." He didn't push. He didn't move. He simply waited, and the waiting was somehow heavier than any demand could have been. Outside, an owl called once low and questioning and was answered by nothing. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe because she was too tired to fight a man who hadn't actually fought her yet. Maybe because she had been holding the bruise alone for 2 days, and the weight of it had grown heavier than she could carry through a forest in a storm. Maybe because the coat smelled like cedar and winter wind, and she was not it, turned out, made of stone. She pulled her sleeve back. The lightning was kind enough to come at exactly that moment, one slow pulse of white just long enough to show him the dark band wrapped around her wrist. The shape of fingers, a man's fingers, too big for her own. She heard him inhale. It was a very small sound, the kind of sound a man makes when he is deciding very carefully not to make a louder one. When he spoke, his voice had changed. It was still quiet, still calm. But something underneath it had moved the way the surface of a deep lake moves when something large turns over far below. Who did that to you? It doesn't matter. Who? It doesn't matter because by morning I'll be far enough away that it never has to matter again. That isn't an answer. It's the only one I'm giving you tonight, she said. And even through everything, she felt a small flare of satisfaction at the way she'd thrown his own words back at him. He was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very low. "All right," he said. "All right. Tonight you keep it. Tomorrow we talk." "There's no we." "There is, actually," he said. "You just don't know it yet." She opened her mouth to argue, to tell him that whatever he thought this was, whatever strange arrangement he believed they had simply because she'd fallen into his carriage out of a storm, she would walk out of it the moment the road was clear. That she had not run from one man's claim on her to fall into another's, that she belonged to no one, least of all a stranger with silver eyes who spoke to her in the dark as if he had been waiting for her. She opened her mouth. She didn't say any of it, because somewhere in the middle of forming the words, she finally lost the fight she had been losing for the last hour, and her eyes told her that they were slid closed. The last thing she heard before the dark took her was him exhaling slowly, like a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time, like a man who after 5 years had finally let it go. When she woke, the rain had stopped. Pale gray light was leaking through the small carriage window, the kind of light that came an hour before sunrise when the world was still cold and not yet real. She was still wrapped in the coat. Her cheek was pressed against the velvet of the wall, and across from her, he was watching her. He hadn't slept. She knew it the way you know certain things without being told. He had sat there for hours in the dark in the rain, and he had simply watched her sleep, not the way a guard watches, not the way a hunter watches. The way a man watches something he has stopped expecting to find. She sat up slowly. Her heart was beating too fast. The lightning was gone now. The dawn was coming. And in the soft, pale, true light of a morning after a storm, she saw him fully for the first time. He was God, help her beautiful. And he was looking at her like she was a country he had crossed an ocean to see. She opened her mouth to say something she didn't know what when a sharp, polite knock came at the carriage door. 3 crisp raps. A pause. Then a voice from outside, deferential and clear. "Your Majesty, the road is clear. We can move whenever you wish." The world stopped. Alara turned her head very slowly toward the man across from her. He hadn't looked away from her face. "Majesty," she whispered. His mouth, that hard and beautiful mouth, lifted just slightly at one corner. Not a smile. Something quieter than a smile. "I was going to tell you," he said. "After breakfast." The carriage moved before Alara had finished understanding the word majesty. She sat very still on the velvet seat, the coat still wrapped around her, and watched the man across from her as the wheels began to turn beneath them. He had not moved either. He had only let his eyes drop briefly to the bruise on her wrist, the bruise he had asked about and let her keep, and then back to her face, as if to be sure she had not vanished while he wasn't looking. She tried to speak twice before words came. "You're the Alpha King." "Yes." "Of the Northern Pack." "Yes." "And you let me sit in your carriage all night and call you a stranger." "You were calling me worse than that most of the night." "I held a door handle at you." "I noticed." She didn't laugh. She couldn't quite. But something in her chest, which had been wound tight as a clock spring since she had climbed out her bedroom window, eased by one small notch, and she hated that it did. She hated that a single line of dry humor from a man she did not know had loosened something her father's house had taken 19 years to wind. She gathered the coat tighter. "Where are we going?" "Home," he said. "Whose home?" "Mine." "I didn't agree to that." "You agreed to it when you didn't open the door at sunrise." "I was asleep at sunrise." "You were awake an hour before that. I watched you decide not to run." Heat climbed up the side of her neck. She turned her face to the small window before he could see it. Outside, the road was unfamiliar, wider than the eastern road she had taken into the forest, paved with pale stones that had been laid a very long time ago by people who knew how to make a road that lasted. Ahead, the trees began to thin, and in the far gray distance where the morning mist was just beginning to lift off the valley, she saw it. The castle. It rose out of the pale stone of the mountain itself as if the mountain had decided one day to grow walls. It was not gaudy. It was not the kind of castle that decorated itself with banners and gold. It was the kind of castle that did not need to. Long, narrow towers, dark slate roofs, walls the color of moonlight on snow. Even from this distance, Alara could see the wolves carved above the main gate, 3 of them, in profile mouths open in a soundless howl. She had heard stories of this place. Every child in the kingdom had. The castle of Silver Stone, the seat of the Alpha King, a place where the village women whispered the walls themselves, remembered the names of every Luna who had ever crossed the threshold. There had not been a Luna in 5 years. She knew that the way she knew the shape of her own hand. Everyone knew it. The young Alpha King, who had inherited the throne at 26, who had refused every match the council had brought him, who was rumored, depending on which woman in the market was talking, to be either cursed heartbroken or simply incapable of love. She looked at the man across from her. He did not look incapable of anything. "How old are you?" she asked before she could stop herself. 31. "Are you cursed?" The corner of his mouth lifted just barely. "Not in the way the stories say." "In what way, then?" He looked at her for a long moment. The dawn light caught his eyes and turned the silver to something paler still. "I'll tell you," he said. "Not today. Soon." The carriage passed under the gate. The courtyard inside was already alive. Stable boys ran for the horses. A line of men in dark uniforms guards, she realized. Though they wore no insignia, she recognized, stepped back into a smooth line against the wall as the carriage drew to a halt. Servants in pale gray livery hurried out from a side door, and an older man with iron gray hair and a long, austere face came down the main steps to meet them, his hands clasped behind his back as if he had been standing in that exact spot for some time and intended to stand in it for some time more. Kael, she had not even known his name an hour ago, had heard it for the first time when the older man bowed and said, "Welcome home." My king stepped down from the carriage first. Then he turned and held out his hand to her. The whole courtyard went very, very quiet. Alara understood in that long second that no one in this castle had been told he was bringing anyone home. She put her hand in his. His fingers were warm. Hers were cold. He closed his hand around hers slowly, as if she were something that might break if he was careless, and she stepped down out of the carriage in his coat, the king's coat, onto the stones of a courtyard that was suddenly full of people who did not know what to do with their faces. The older man recovered first. "My lady," he said and bowed. He did not ask who she was. That she understood was a kindness. "I am Aldrich, the king's steward. Please, allow me to show you to a chamber where you can rest and change." "Aldrich," Kael said without looking away from her. "She is to have the east guest suite, the one with the garden door. and she is to be treated as my personal guest until I say otherwise." "Of course, Your Majesty." "And Aldrich." "My king. She is not to be questioned by anyone, including the council." A faint pause. "Understood." Alara could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the courtyard. She lifted her chin a fraction higher. Her father's house had taught her almost nothing she wanted to remember, but it had taught her how to walk into a room full of people who were trying to decide what she was worth and not flinch. She let go of Cale's hand. She inclined her head to the steward, neither too deep nor too shallow, the bow of a woman who was nobody's servant, and she followed him up the steps and through the great oak doors of the castle of Silverstone without once looking back. She knew without having to check that the king was watching her go. She felt it like a hand on the back of her neck. The East guest suite was larger than the entire upper floor of her father's house. A sitting room with tall windows opening onto a private walled garden. A bedroom beyond that with a 4-poster bed dressed in dove-gray silk. A bathing room with a copper tub already being filled somehow by 2 young women who curtsied without quite meeting her eyes and slipped out the moment the water was hot. There was a tray of food on a low table, warm bread, butter, soft cheese, a small bowl of dark winter berries, a pot of tea that smelled of something she did not recognize but immediately wanted more of. Alara stood in the middle of the room with the king's coat still around her shoulders and felt something dangerous happen in her chest. She felt for one terrible second safe. She made herself sit down on the edge of the bed. She made herself remember Lord Voss's hand on her head when she was 11. She made herself remember 3 women whose names no one was allowed to say. Safety is not a place her grandmother had told her once in the year before she died. Safety is who has the key. Alara did not yet know who had the key to this room. She did not know whether the door locked from the inside or only from the outside, or whether it locked at all. She did not know who Kyle Valoran truly was beneath the coat she was wearing, or what he had decided last night in the dark while she slept in front of him like a fool. She did not know, but the bread was warm and her hands had stopped shaking, and somewhere in the corridor outside, a young woman was arguing with the steward in a low, fierce voice that sounded impossibly familiar. The door opened. "My lady, I'm so sorry. I told them I knew you. I told them—" Mara. She was across the room before she knew she had moved. Mara, pale, breathless, still in her gray traveling cloak, her hair half undone from however she had ridden through the night to get here, caught her with both arms and held on. And for a long moment, Alara could not tell whose shoulders were shaking harder. "How—" she finally managed. "How are you here?" "I followed you," Mara whispered. "I waited an hour. I couldn't. My lady." "I couldn't stay there, knowing what I'd helped you do. I took the kitchen mare. I rode east. I lost the trail in the forest, and I thought— She pulled back, eyes shining. "And then at dawn, I saw the king's carriage on the high road. I followed it. The steward almost didn't let me through the gate." "You rode through that storm. You walked through it. You could have died." "So could you," Mara said simply. "I wasn't going to let you die alone." Alara hugged her again harder. She did not cry. She did not let herself. But her grip on the back of Mara's cloak was the grip of a woman who had just been handed back the only piece of her old life she would have asked to keep. Behind them, the steward cleared his throat from the doorway. "My lady, if you wish, this young woman may serve as your personal maid during your stay. With your permission, I will have a room arranged for her adjoining yours." "Yes," Alara said, before her voice could shake. "Yes, please." Aldrich bowed and withdrew. It was not until the door had closed and Mara had begun with shaking hands to help her out of the soaked dress she had not yet thought to remove that Alara understood something. The king had given the order before Mara had arrived. "She is to be treated as my personal guest until I say otherwise." The steward had not asked whether the breathless young woman in the corridor was telling the truth about knowing the lady in the East Suite. He had not sent for the king to confirm anything. He had simply taken one look at Mara's face and at Alara's and had decided on a king's standing order given an hour earlier that whatever the lady in the East Suite wanted the lady in the East Suite would have. She did not know yet what to do with that. She filed it away with the silver eyes and the smell of cedar, and the way he had said the rest can wait until morning in a dark carriage, to a woman whose name he did not yet know. 2 floors below, in a long, narrow room hung with old maps, the council was already in session. There were 5 of them. Aldrich was not among them. The steward served the king's household, not the king's council, and the difference on a morning like this mattered. The man at the head of the table was Lord Hadrian, the king's senior advisor, a wolf of 63 who had served Kael's father before him and considered himself with some justice the only reason this kingdom had not torn itself apart during the regency years. He was the one who had spent the last 14 months arranging the king's marriage to Lady Seraphine of the Western Reach. He was the one who had been told this morning by a stable boy, who had been told by a guard, who had been told by a kitchen girl, who had seen the carriage arrive, that the king had come home from his diplomatic failure in the south with a woman in his coat. Lord Hadrian set his cup of tea down very carefully on its saucer. "Tell me again," he said to the man on his right, "what the steward said." "He said the lady is to be treated as the king's personal guest, my lord, until he says otherwise. And the king's exact words, she is not to be questioned by anyone, including the council." A long silence. "Including the council," Hadrian repeated. "Yes, my lord." Hadrian picked his cup back up. His hands, after 63 years, did not shake easily. They did not shake now. But the tea inside the cup made one slow, deliberate ripple, and then another. "Send a rider to the Western Reach fast," he said. "Tell Lady Seraphine that the king has returned safely from the south, and that the matter of her arrival here will be discussed in council this evening. Word it carefully. My lord, with respect, should we not wait until we know who the woman is?" Hadrian looked up. His pale eyes were perfectly calm. "We know exactly who she is," he said. "She is a problem, and problems in this house are best handled before the king has had time to grow attached to them." He set the cup back down. The tea did not ripple again. Upstairs in the East guest suite, Alara stepped into the copper tub for the first hot bath she had taken in 3 years, and let her head fall back against the rim and closed her eyes, and did not yet know that 2 floors below her in a room hung with old maps, a man she had never met had just decided to take her away from the king, before the king had finished bringing her home. 3 days passed before he came to her. Not because he didn't want to. Alara could feel that the way she had begun to feel many things in the castle of Silverstone, in glances across long tables, in the way the corridors seemed to know when she had stopped walking, in the way certain doors were always somehow slightly open when she passed them. She did not see Kael at breakfast. She did not see him in the long gallery where Mara walked her in the afternoons. She saw him once from the window of her sitting room, riding back through the gate at dusk with 3 of his men, and even at that distance, even through glass, she felt the moment he looked up. He had known exactly which window she was at. On the 3rd night, the knock came. It was not the steward's knock. The steward knocked 3 times and waited. This was one knock. Once. The way a man knocks who has already decided he is coming in if she does not answer, and has chosen instead to give her the gift of pretending she had a choice. She set down the book she had not been reading. "Come in." He had changed since the carriage, or perhaps the carriage had changed her. He was in dark gray now, no coat, no insignia, just a fine wool tunic open at the throat and trousers that were not made for riding, and he looked for the first time since she had met him like a man and not a king. He closed the door behind him. He did not come any closer. "I owe you 3 days of answers," he said. "I haven't asked any questions." "I know. That's why I owe them." She rose slowly from the chair by the fire. Mara had gone to bed in the adjoining room an hour ago. The castle beyond their door was very quiet, the kind of quiet that meant a household had finished its evening duties and decided by some silent collective agreement not to disturb a certain corridor on a certain floor. She had not realized until that moment that the entire castle had known he would come tonight. "Then talk," she said. He took 1 step into the room, only 1. "My name is Kael Valoran. I am the Alpha King of the Northern Pack, and I have been since I was 26. I inherited the throne the night my father died, which was the same night I learned that an alpha king without a Luna does not rule for long. 5 years is the longest a king of this line has ever held the throne unmated. I am 5 years and 4 months in. Why are you telling me this? Because it matters that you know what you walked into, not after, now. I didn't walk into anything. I climbed into a carriage in a storm. Yes, he said quietly. You did. He took another step. The firelight caught his eyes and turned them briefly to something she did not have a word for. Werewolves recognize their mate by scent, he said. Most of us recognize it once and never forget it. Some of us recognize it before we have words for what we are, and some of us, a small number in old bloodlines, wait their whole lives. The bond, when it comes whole. You don't grow into it. You don't decide on it. It is the body deciding that this person out of every person in the world is the one. There is no second one. There is no negotiation. She had stopped breathing again. When you opened that carriage door, he said, I had not been able to breathe properly in 5 years. I had begun to think I was one of the ones the bond would never find. I had given the council permission 2 weeks ago to begin negotiations for a political match. I had told myself I would learn to live with a marriage that was not that. And then you fell into a seat that no one had ever sat in but me, soaked through and shaking and holding a door handle at me like it was a sword. And the first thing I smelled was the only thing I have ever wanted to smell. Stop, she said. He stopped. She pressed her hand against the back of the chair to keep it steady. The fire was very loud suddenly, or her pulse was. She could not tell. You can't tell me a thing like that and expect me to... I am not expecting anything from you. Then why are you telling me? Because you deserve to know what you are. Not what you are to me. What you are. You are a Luna. You were born one. There's a reason your father was able to sell you for the price he got, and it isn't the one he told you. You are the only person in the world whose absence I have been able to feel for 5 years without knowing whose absence I was feeling. And you are standing in my house wearing a dress my steward chose for you 3 days after climbing into my carriage, and you have not asked me for a single thing. Not safety, not protection, not even a ride to the next town. I didn't want to owe you anything. I know, he said. That is why I haven't offered. The fire cracked. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, he had crossed half the distance between them. Not all of it. He had stopped where the firelight ended, as if he understood exactly that the last few steps had to be hers. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought of her father's house. She thought of Lord Voss. She thought of 3 women whose names no one was allowed to say. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her, I have spent my whole life being chosen by men who didn't ask. This is the first one who is asking by not asking. And if I take one more step, I will have chosen too. She took the step. She took the next one. He did not reach for her until she was close enough that he did not have to. His hand came up slowly, the back of his knuckles, not his palm, the gentlest part of a hand that had held a sword since he was 14, and brushed once along the line of her jaw. He was watching her face the whole time, watching for the moment she would flinch. She did not flinch. "What's your name?" he said softly. "You know my name." "I know what your father called you. I want to know what you call yourself." Her breath caught. "Ilara. Ilara." He said it the way a man tastes water after a long ride. "Ilara." "Stop saying it like that." "I've waited 5 years to say it. I am going to say it for a while." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite anything else, and then his other hand came up too, and his thumb traced very lightly the place beneath her ear, and her eyes slid closed before she had given them permission. When he kissed her, it was nothing like she had expected. She had expected hunger. She had expected a man who had waited 5 years to take. What she got instead was a man who had waited 5 years to be careful, who kissed her the way a man kisses a thing he intends to keep for the rest of his life, and therefore has no reason to rush. His mouth was warm, his hands stayed at her jaw and her throat no lower. He did not press her against anything. He did not crowd her. He simply kissed her slowly and slowly and slowly, and somewhere in the middle of it she understood that she had been holding her shoulders up around her ears for 19 years, and she let them drop. He felt it. He breathed out against her mouth, a small, ragged sound, the first uncontrolled thing she had ever heard from him, and then he pulled back and pressed his forehead against hers, and said her name once more, like a man saying a prayer he had stopped believing he was allowed to say. "I'm not going to do this tonight, Yum," he said quietly. "Do what?" "Mark you, mate you, any of it. Not while you are 3 days out of a forest and a bruise on your wrist." "I didn't ask you to." "I know. I am telling you that I won't, so that when it happens, if it happens, you will know it was a thing you chose with both eyes open, not a thing I took while you were tired." She did not know what to do with that. She had been ready again for cruelty. She had not been ready again for this. She pressed her face into the hollow of his throat, only for a moment, only because her legs had stopped agreeing with her, only because he smelled of cedar and winter wind and the rest of her life. And his arms came around her slowly, as if he were afraid she might break if he was careless, and they stood like that for what might have been a minute and might have been an hour. A bell rang somewhere deep in the castle. It rang once, and then again urgently. The second ring had a different pitch, a low alarm note that even Alara, who had never set foot in this house before 3 days ago, understood at once. The gate bell, a late rider. Kael's whole body changed. He did not pull away from her. He simply went still the way she had first seen him, go still in the dark of the carriage, the stillness of an animal who has heard something a long way off. His hand stayed at the small of her back. His other hand, the one that had been at her jaw, came up slowly, deliberately, and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. "Stay here," he said. "Lock the door behind me." "What is it?" "Probably nothing." "You are a very bad liar for a king." "I am an excellent liar for a king," he said. "I am a bad one for you. Lock the door, Alara." She locked the door. She stood with her hand against the wood and her ear to it, and she listened to his footsteps go down the corridor fast, but not running, and she heard another set of footsteps meet his at the stairs. Aldrich, she thought, by the rhythm, and she heard them descend together, and she heard very faintly the great front doors of the castle of Silverstone open onto the night. She heard a voice from the courtyard, a voice she had heard her whole life, a voice that had once patted her on the head when she was 11 and called her something useful. Lord Voss had come for his bride. She did not remember sitting down. She found herself some unknown number of minutes later on the floor with her back against the door and her hands flat against the wood, as if she could hold the night out of the room through sheer pressure of palms. Mara found her there. Mara had heard the bell, too. Mara, who had spent 3 days learning the rhythms of this castle the way only a maid can learn them, had already been pulling a shawl around her nightdress when Alara had not answered the soft knock from the adjoining room. She did not say anything at first. She simply sat down on the floor beside Alara and took her hand and held it. "He followed me," Alara whispered. "I know. He'll say I owe him. He paid the debt. There's a contract." "I know. Kael won't give me back. He won't. But Mara—" "I know, my lady. They will go to war over me." Mara was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said finally. "They will." Alara closed her eyes. She thought of the courtyard 3 days ago, full of guards in dark uniforms who had stepped back into a line when their king had stepped down. She thought of the council she had not yet been allowed to meet, and of Lord Hadrian, whom she had seen exactly once at the far end of a corridor, and who had inclined his head to her with a courtesy so cold it had felt like a closed door. She thought of the political match Kael had agreed to begin negotiating 2 weeks ago. She thought of Lady Seraphine of the Western Reach, a name Mara had heard from a kitchen girl who had heard it from a footman, and of the alliance that name carried with it. An alliance the kingdom needed. An alliance the council had been building for 14 months. She thought of all of this, and she thought of Kael downstairs in a courtyard with Lord Voss Kael, who had not yet marked her, who had not yet mated her, who had told her an hour ago that he was waiting for her to choose with both eyes open. She opened her eyes. "Mara, my lady." "If I left tonight," Alara said quietly, "before the council meets in the morning, before he has to choose between me and the kingdom, could you get me as far as the Eastern Road?" Mara did not answer at once. When she did, her voice was very soft. "Yes," she said, "I could." "Would you come with me?" "Yes, even though it is the wrong thing." Mara looked at her for a long moment in the firelight. "My lady," she said, "I do not know yet whether it is the wrong thing. I only know that you are about to do it whether I help you or not, and I would rather be on the road with you than be the one who let you go alone again." Alara did not cry. She had not cried in 3 days, but she pressed her forehead against Mara's shoulder, and she breathed in lavender and bread flour for the second time in her life, and she thought with the same clarity that had made her step into the firelight an hour ago, with the same clarity that had made her step out of her father's house 4 nights ago, "I am not going to be the war he loses his kingdom for. I have been the reason for one man's worst decisions already. I will not be the reason for his." 2 floors below her in the courtyard, Kael Valoran was speaking very quietly to Lord Voss, in a voice that the guards on the wall would later say they had never heard their king use before, not even in the south, not even at the worst of the negotiations, not even the night his father had died. The voice of a man who had finally, after 31 years, found a thing worth being cruel for. He did not know yet that upstairs in a room he had told her to lock the thing he had found was already pulling on a traveling cloak. She made it as far as the eastern gate. The night had turned in the hour since the bell had rung into the kind of night the old women in the village called a returning storm, a second weather pattern that comes on the heels of the first, as if the sky had remembered something it had forgotten to say. The rain had not started yet, but the wind had. It pulled at Alara's cloak and at the mare's mane and at the small lantern Mara was holding up at the head of the path, and somewhere far behind them in the courtyard she could no longer see. The air had begun to shift in a way that had nothing to do with weather. She felt him before she heard him. She had not known until that moment that she had begun to feel him. It was a small thing, a warmth at the base of her spine, the way a hand feels when it is held just above your skin, without touching. And it had been there, she realized, since the night in the carriage. She had simply not had a name for it. Now she did. The hooves came a moment later. One horse ridden hard. No escort. He had not even waited for his guard. "My lady," Mara whispered. "I know. What do you want me to do?" "Go through the gate. Tell the watchman I asked you to fetch something from the village. If anyone asks where I am, you don't know." "My lady." "Mara." Mara went. Alara turned the mare around in the path. He came up the slope at a full gallop and pulled the horse to a stop 10 paces from her, and for a long moment neither of them moved. The wind moved. The trees moved. He did not. His hair was loose. His tunic was open at the throat. He had not put on a coat. He had ridden out into a returning storm with nothing between him and the night but the clothes he had been kissing her in an hour ago. "Get down from the horse," he said. "No." "Alara, I'm not going back, Kael. Get down." "I will not be the war you lose your kingdom for." He was off the horse before she had finished the sentence. He crossed the 10 paces in 3 strides, and his hands closed around her waist, and he lifted her down out of the saddle as if she weighed nothing, and the moment her boots touched the ground he did not let go. He held her there, both hands at her waist, and the wind whipped his hair across his face, and the first cold drops of rain began to fall between them, and his eyes in the dark were the same silver she had seen in the carriage 4 nights ago. "By lightning. You have decided," he said quietly, "that you understand my kingdom better than I do. I understand what an alliance is worth." "Do you?" "Yes." "Then explain to me," he said, "what an alliance is worth to a king whose body has begun in the last hour to forget how to function, because his mate has put on a traveling cloak." She stopped breathing. "I felt you," he said. Through a door, through 2 floors, through Voss's voice in my own courtyard, I felt the moment you decided to leave. Do you understand what that means? It means it has already happened. The bond has already begun. I have not marked you, and I have not mated you, and it does not matter. My body has decided. My wolf has decided. And in 3 days, in 5 days, in a week, when you are far enough away that the bond cannot reach, I will begin to die, Alara. Slowly. The old way. The way kings of this line have died for 1,000 years, when their Luna walks out and does not come back. You're lying. I am not. You would let me believe I am not making you stay. I am telling you what staying means and what leaving means, and then you will choose. You will choose with both eyes open the way I told you you would, but you will choose knowing. The first real wave of rain came down then. It hit her face like cold needles. It plastered his hair to his forehead. He did not seem to notice. He was watching her face the way he had watched it in the carriage, the way he had watched it in the firelight an hour ago, and his hands at her waist were steady and patient and unshaking, as if he had decided that he was prepared to stand in this rain until she had finished choosing, even if it took the rest of the night. She put her hand against his chest. She felt his heart. It was beating very, very fast, faster than a man's heart should beat, faster than even a hard ride could account for. And she understood suddenly that he had not been exaggerating. His body was already failing in small ways. He had ridden out here on the edge of something. He had ridden out here because he had no choice. "Kale," she whispered. "Alara, Voss is in the courtyard." "I know. He has a contract." "I know. What are you going to do?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Whatever you tell me to," he said. "I came out here for one answer. Give me that and I will handle the rest." She looked up at him in the rain. She thought of 3 women whose names no one was allowed to say. She thought of 19 years of being chosen by men who didn't ask. She thought of a man who even now, with his hands at her waist in a returning storm, had not pulled her 1 inch closer than she had agreed to come. "Take me back," she said. He let out the breath he had been holding, for she suspected the entire ride. He did not kiss her. He pressed his forehead against hers in the rain exactly the way he had done in front of the fire, and he said her name once, Alara, and then he lifted her back up into the saddle of her own mare and swung up onto his horse, and they rode back through the eastern gate together with Mara behind them, holding the lantern that had not in the end been needed. The courtyard was full of torches. Lord Voss had brought 12 men. He had counted, no doubt, on the king of the northern pack being too well-mannered or too politically careful to refuse a debt presented in front of witnesses. He had not counted on the king of the northern pack returning to that courtyard at the head of a small, wet procession with the disputed bride riding at his right hand and a face that had stopped pretending to be polite. Kale did not dismount. "Lord Voss," he said. The voice was the courtyard voice. The wall guards would later say they had never heard it voice. "Your Majesty." Voss bowed. He was 62 and slightly stooped now in the torchlight, and Alara realized with a dull surprise that she had been afraid of him her whole life, and from horseback he looked very small. "I see you have recovered my betrothed from whatever misadventure she is not your betrothed. With respect, Your Majesty, I have a signed contract." "You have a contract signed by a man who sold a daughter he did not have the right to sell for a debt he incurred at your gaming table against a bride price you offered him, knowing he could not refuse it." Kale's voice did not rise. "I have spent the last 3 days having that contract examined. I have also spent the last 3 days having you examined. Would you like me to read aloud in this courtyard the names of the 3 women you have buried and the circumstances under which each of them died? I have them. My men found the 3rd one's grave yesterday, the one no one was allowed to speak of. She is buried, Lord Voss, in a place you did not bury her." The courtyard had gone very, very still. Voss had gone the color of ash. "Your Majesty," he said. His voice cracked. "These are... You will leave my lands tonight. You will be escorted to the southern border by men of my choosing. The contract you hold is void by the laws of this kingdom, which do not recognize the sale of a Luna-born daughter under any debt. And the matter of 3 murdered women will be heard by a tribunal of your own pack within the month, with the evidence I have gathered submitted to them as a courtesy from the throne. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Voss did not answer. "Do you understand what I'm telling you, my lord?" "Yes," Voss whispered. "Then go." He went. The guards closed around him as he was led out of the courtyard and the gate shut behind him, with a sound that Alara felt in her chest. And for a moment, the courtyard was only torches and rain and breathing. Then Kael dismounted. He walked around to her mare and held up his hand to her, and she put her hand in his for the second time in this courtyard, and he turned with her hand in his to face the men and women of his household, and his council and his guard, who had all by now come out into the rain. Lord Hadrian stood on the front steps. His face was unreadable. "My household," Kael said. His voice carried. "This is Alara of the Eastern Valley. She is a Luna by birth and by the bond. She came to this house 4 nights ago by accident, and she remains in this house tonight by choice. The negotiations with the Western Reach are ended as of this hour. I will write to Lady Seraphine myself before dawn. From this moment in this house and in this kingdom, Alara is my mate promised and your Luna to be. You will treat her accordingly." He looked then at Lord Hadrian. Hadrian held his gaze for a long, careful moment. Then slowly, the way a wolf of 63 years and considerable pride bows, only when he has read the wind correctly, he inclined his head. "My king," he said, "my Luna." The courtyard followed him. Every man and woman in the rain dropped to one knee. Even Mara on the steps holding the lantern that had not been needed, bowed her head and then looked up at Alara through the rain and smiled the smile of a maid who has just watched her lady walk out of one life and into a different one without dying in the forest in between. Alara did not know what her face did then. She felt Kael's hand close more firmly around hers. She felt the rain on her cheeks. She felt for the first time in 19 years the strange, clean weight of a room full of people looking at her and not trying to decide what she was worth. They had already decided. She was theirs, and he was hers. She did not say anything aloud. She did not have to. She squeezed his hand once, and he squeezed back, and that in the rain in the torchlight, with a kingdom on its knees around them, was the answer to the only question that had ever needed asking. Spring came early that year. The castle of Silverstone, which had not held a mating ceremony in 5 years, held one on the first true warm night of the season, under a sky so full of stars that the old women said the moon herself had stepped back to give them room. Alara wore no white. She had asked very specifically not to. She wore deep gray instead, the color of the sky just before a storm, and her hair was loose and her wrist. The wrist that had once worn a bruise wore now a thin silver cuff that Kael had pressed against his own mouth before he had closed it around her arm. Mara was at her side. Lord Hadrian gave the blessing himself. That night in the East guest suite that had been hers since the morning after the carriage, which was now their suite and would be for the rest of their lives, Kael pressed his forehead against hers in the dark and said her name once, the way he had said it the first night he had said it, and the way he would say it every night for the rest of their lives. And in the dark of his chest, where she had pressed her face for the second time in her life, Alara, who had once climbed into a stranger's carriage in a storm because she had no other roof, felt very quietly for the first time in 3 months the small, certain flutter of a second heartbeat under her own. She did not tell him yet. She was going to wait until breakfast.